Hello, good morning and good afternoon. Good morning here in Rio for our presential speakers and public, and to our online speakers, good afternoon, and also online public. We are starting today the second day of our seminar, Multilateralism, Democracy and EU Latin American and Caribbean Relations in Times of Permacrisis. This is a seminar organized by the Jean Monnet Network, Crisis, Equity, Democracy for Europe and Latin America. Yesterday, we had our first day of the event, and we had a keynote speaker streamed live from the UI of Joseph Stiglitz, who introduced us into this broad topic from a global level systemic view. We followed with a panel on multilateralism and democracy in crisis, where we also discussed common issues from the point of view of Latin America and the EU, but talking about the global level multilateralism, including UN and other groupings as well, and the relationship between what we perceive as crisis of democracies in a lot of countries in these regions and other regions as well, and the weakening or the threats to current international order and multilateral system. Then we had in the afternoon a panel about EU-LAC relations in context, where we discussed some issues, not all, in a panel it's impossible, but we focused at least on economic issues, trade, and also finance, macroeconomic, what we have in macroeconomic cooperation in these relationships. And also we focus on the two issue areas that it will also be the case today, of the environment, climate change, and health, broadly speaking. So issues that we see as not new, but perhaps that because of some of these crises that we were living became also more relevant for the discussion. So today I have the honor here to present our table, our round table, taking stock of the EU-LAC summit and thinking ahead, meaning that now we focus a bit more directly on the bi-regional relations, the relations between the EU and Latin American countries through also this institution called CELAC. This CELAC, but also the interregional dialogue, was suspended for 9 years. So it was when it was announced and when it became clear that it would take place, and it took place, I think it was already a good sign of some strengthening, or at least some more political will to engage at the multilateral level in these interregional relations. However, I think we'll be discussing that, of course. However, we saw that in terms of, well, the official outputs in terms of the declaration, but also a lot of discussions about that summit afterwards. Maybe it was a bit of a, yeah, not as much as we had hoped, but I don't want to influence the debate. We'll be discussing that. And for that discussion, we have a panel, a quite full panel. We have 6 speakers. Therefore, I actually ask you to speak 10-15 minutes at the most, so we can have really time for discussions, because I'm pretty sure that we can engage after from our initial exposition. So I'll present everyone in the beginning so we can have the flow later. Smoother. We start with Jacinth Jordana and Andrea Biancoli, and I believe Andrea Biancoli will be speaking there, from eBay. It's a partner from the Jean Monnet Network. They are in Barcelona, in Spain. Then Christian Guimers, from also an institution partner from the Jean Monnet Network, EU-LAC in Belgium. Then Detlef Nolte from GIGA, in Germany, who, yeah, unfortunately was coming, but maybe he will talk about it. He couldn't come in person after all. Then we have Ademar Mineiro from Rebrip, and I'll present the institutions later as well. It's an association from the civil society that includes a lot of NGOs and movements. Then we have Carolina Salgado, who is a professor here at PUC, and she's also a researcher from the research network. And finally, Nicola Billotta from the Institute of International Affairs from Rome, who is now a fellow from the European University Institute. And we all focus on the results of the summit, but of course from different, not only points of view, but also specific issues. So I think we start with Andrea, who I think maybe you can speak. It's a little bit of a different presentation because she'll be talking about also a database that we are preparing that will be also for the project, something that will be available for research for all the interested. So Andrea, if you can start, please.
Sure. I would like to share my presentation. Can you see my presentation? Yes. Okay, so first of all, I would like to excuse Jacine Jordana, who couldn't make it today. As Andrea explained, my presentation will focus on EU-LAC relations, but it will be mostly based on the idea of where from and where to. Where do these relations come from, and where do we think they are leading or they can get in the future? So as she mentioned during the introduction, my presentation is based on a database, the initial analysis of a database we have been constructing at eBay, where we have collected information on the different policy instruments that were deployed by the European Union towards the region. And this meant collecting information starting in 1961 to 2023. So I will first set the context for this research and present some of these initial findings and assess these findings considering the recent summit. So we all know that EU and Latin America have a very long history of relations which operate through different agendas and at different levels of governance. More specifically, the European Union has deployed a variety of policy instruments in relation with Latin America that have also worked at different levels and across different policy areas. In our study and through the construction of this novel database, we intend to provide a deeper understanding of these interregional dynamics through a policy approach. Through this policy approach, we attempt to assess relations across policy sectors and their territorial dimensions. More specifically, we look into the policy instruments that the European Union has deployed across time to reach out, to relate with the region. In so doing, what we intend to see is, or assess, is the continuity and transformation of these policy instruments over the years, their interrelation between sectors and the territorial dimensions. That means that we attempt to assess variation across time, across policy areas, and across regions and countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. This will also allow us to discuss whether or not these instruments reflect the objectives and to what extent they have succeeded in generating the intended dynamics, even if we're not making any kind of evaluation here. So the database comprises 239 agreements from 1961 to 2022, 32 programs, 20 networks, and one international organization which would be the EU-LAC Foundation. The database was very much based on an inclusive approach to capture these policy instruments, and we define type of instruments as a device that's intended to translate a policy problem, a policy issue into effective action to correct the real and or perceived defect in society or economy. So this is quite a frequent definition of type of instruments, and we have identified 4 categories: agreements, programs, networks, and organizations. In more practical terms, what do these categories represent or stand for? So when we talk about agreements, we talk about formal and written arrangements between the European Union and Latin America. This includes bilateral agreements like the ones the European Union signed with different countries in the area of textiles, nuclear energy, like the agreement with Brazil and Argentina going back to the 1980s, food aid, agreements intended to address particular issues under the GATT or the GATS, the multi-party agreements as that of the one with Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru as part of the Andean community, and the more typical or ideal type region to region, like the economic partnership agreement between the CARIFORUM states and the European community. By programs, we mean these, all those project activities under cooperation and development as Adelante, Euroclima Plus, and networks comprises these transgovernmental, transnational groups that can be identified as those under ERANET or ALCUENET. And as I said, in terms of international organizations, so far we have only found one, which is the EU-LAC Foundation. My presentation today focuses on two of these instruments, that's agreements and programs. So these graphs shows how these two different types of agreements have been used across time. So it's clear that starting in the 1960s and until the mid-1990s, the main type of instrument that the European Union used to relate to Latin America were agreements. These agreements grow during the 1990s and come to a sort of an impasse in the early 2000s. Programs, on the contrary, only start in the mid-1990s. They show, or they tend to have been in the rise, especially after 2007 and in more recent years. So the idea of these graphs is that it shows when agreements were signed and when programs were initiated. When we look into cooperation, as I said, we have identified 32 programs. These programs are either exclusively funded by the European Union or funded by the European Union in conjunction with other international and regional organizations and countries. And they are specifically intended to address the region. What do we mean by this? That we have not included programs like Erasmus Plus, Horizon Europe, where the region and Latin American countries can participate and get funded, mainly because they are framed and implemented as part of a more global strategy, right? So the programs here either comprise Latin American countries, usually more than one country, or regions. So programs have been in place since 1994, and they tend to show a duration that goes from 1 year to almost 14 years. If we look across how long these programs remain in place and the budget they deploy in 1 year, we also see some interesting differences or variations. So more recent ones like Al-Invest and LIST, they show a larger budget, while those in urban policy show smaller ones. And interestingly, these programs with a focus on urban policies were mostly deployed in the 1990s. In a second stage, we grouped programs according to the policy area they were mainly intended to address. This is difficult when working with programs because programs tend to have lots of objectives, but we try to identify the main policy area to make it comparable. So we find that the area of climate action and sustainable development has been funded for more than 40 years. This is because we add the number of years that the different programs included in this category have been in place. So here we can find the Caribbean Investment Facility, the various Euroclima programs that have been in place, and also the Latin American Investment Facility. Interestingly, higher education is the second policy area that has received funding for many years. And here programs do go back to 1994, starting with Alpha 1, 2, and 3, and also the Alban program. On the contrary, we see that triangular cooperation only starts in 2015, with Adelante, and information society is promoted through LIS, and which is the Alliance for the Information Society since 2002. So this is time, but what about the funding? Which policy areas are the ones that receive the largest or the greatest amount of funding? And here it's striking because it's higher education and enterprises that are the two areas where we find the largest funding. And to some extent, urban policies, right? The urban policies is interesting because we have started looking into the actors. So in urban policies, the actors are mostly city councils and subnational governments, right? The least funded policy area is triangular cooperation. And this is, I would say, because it's the newer area, but also it has to do very much with the logic of triangular cooperation, which usually involves 3 partners, and at least 2 of them are provide the funding. I mean, when we talk about triangular cooperation, it's not only about funding, but also about expertise, capacity building, etc. And this graph shows how funding has proceeded across policy areas and across time. So there are some areas that show continuity in time, despite some interruptions or impasses. But to my understanding, it's difficult to find a clear pattern, right? So as said, higher education has been in place for some time, with funding growing and decreasing. And we also see the emergence of a novel policy area, which is not surprising in the current international context, which has to do with security and transnational crime. So to start concluding, based on this first analysis of the data we have collected, it seems that that relevant changes have occurred across time within these different inter-regional dynamics and spaces. These changes are evident in terms of the type of instruments that we see, as I mentioned before, that were from the 1960s to the 1990s, everything was about agreements. Since the 2000s, programs have been increasing. Agreements have also changed across time, so they move from the bilateral agreements to the more complex association agreements, with the complexity in the negotiation that these agreements entail, as we know, right? These transformations are also reflected in the sectors and policy areas covered. And also we find that even if the European Union in most of the cases remain as the main funding actor, there are also relevant regional actors that become involved in programs. And this has to do with regional development banks like CAF, the Inter-American Development Bank, but also ECLAC, the Pan-American Health Organization, the World Health Organization, among others. But there seems to be some lack of consistency when it comes to the implementation of these policy instruments, and quite weak interconnections between them. This could be explained by the institutional structure of the European Union, but also it could be explained by some sectoral logics. So in terms of the challenges and opportunities ahead, of course, the trade agenda has been a relevant element in these relations. There's still relevant negotiations to be finalized, like the EU and Mercosur agreement and the modernization agreement with Chile and Mexico. In the case of political dialogue, this has proceeded between blocs, as in the case of the interregional dialogues with Mercosur and the Andean community, but also through EU-LAC, and this is an actor that the latest summit has certainly portrayed as a relevant actor in these interregional dynamics. And in the area of cooperation, certainly this is a dense area, including different policy sectors. In this respect, I would say it's worth mentioning that the European Union used to have these regional strategies, right, that are no longer in place, plus some countries are no longer, can no longer receive funds, right? And this adds to the extent to which these type of programs are now increasingly being promoted through bilateral initiatives, especially through Teams Europe, which is the mechanism that will be responsible for example, the Global Gateway Strategy. I have some final ideas, but maybe we can discuss these later on. So the idea is that we have seen a move from pure interregionalism to more diverse strategies. Very much this speaks to the extent to which interregionalism can adapt and to the pragmatism of both actors. The need maybe to promote both political dialogue and technical cooperation, and to look beyond formal and institutional mechanisms. In this case, this first analysis is very much based on the formal and institutional mechanisms, but we intend to move beyond this by looking into the networks. I think I can leave it at that because I'm sort of running out of time. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's really nice to see this now. And I think it informs a lot for our discussion later. So we move straight to Christian. Yes, exactly. Please, Christian. Maximum 15 minutes, please. Yeah, I'll be counting the minutes.
Okay. Thank you for making me possible at distance to be present with you. And hello to the dear colleague from the network. As you know, I was unable to join for program of health treatment, so the dates were incompatible. So let's go to our subject. So we have a very huge potential in genuine cooperation between such a big space, 60 countries, more than 1 billion citizens, 1/3 of the political vote in United Nations, more than 20% of world GDP, 7 members of these two regions are active in the G20, and officially they are all promoting multilateralism, which is not so current at this moment. So with this potential, the problem is that, and this is my own assessment, the process of what I named the diplomacy of summit is relatively disappointing, because, as you know, it started 24 years ago in Rio with the very important objective, which was to agree upon a strategic alliance between both regions. We had already 9 bi-regional summits, and the last 3 summits were with the CELAC. That means with the possibility for the region to have a coordination, potentially. And unfortunately, this potential was not used by CELAC because we had 8 years of suspension. Of course, this is not only due to the ideological division inside CELAC, but it was also due to the EU lack of interest and involvement. But essentially, the incapacity to coordinate played a role on both sides, especially inside CELAC, as you know. The big change in the world landscape make that now apparently both regions would like to renew their relation, and the bi-regional summit for that was a nice opportunity. Both regions are on the process of a marginalization because they are losing market share, losing growth potential, cooperation is also with problems, and even the so famous share values are relatively contested or relatively put into question. So the Brussels summit purpose was like a late attempt to reverse these negative trends. What are the results? And I propose to elaborate more on that. But my view is that the net balance is clearly negative because we miss the target, no strategic alliance, in a moment where it would have been so important to have a strategic alliance for facing the global challenge like climate change and autocratic aggression from some regime. However, there are some positive aspects, of course. So let me start with the positive aspect. Well, most of the observers consider that the fact that the summit took place was already a success. Well, it's a strange way to evaluate a summit, but it is true that what was said that with astonishment that finally it was possible to meet between 60 countries in spite of having a lot of hypocrisy in the joint declaration, not just from Nicaragua, who refused to sign it, but essentially, I'll elaborate more in the negative aspect, but the joint declaration is just a diplomatic declaration. However, in this declaration, in spite of to be words after words, you could see the main priorities of both regions, like climate change. The reform of international financial architecture is a very important topic, and we have, at least in the wording, an agreement to work together to this, and I consider this really something positive after more than 20 years that this was proposed by a lot of people, among myself. And also the role of parliamentary diplomacy opens more possibility to make progress in the future. There is also a full agreement on a joint roadmap for the 2 following years. This is something positive because in this roadmap, it is already scheduled to have a next bi-regional summit in 2025. The creation of a coordination mechanism is also something very positive for preventing that the political evolution could create interruption, as it was the case. We missed already 2 successive bi-regional summits. There is also a lot of money at stake with the global gateway that the EU proposed, a multiplication by 10 of the total financial resources, but for the world. For Latin America, it's about 45 billion, which are proposed by the EU to go to infrastructure in the CELAC region. So it is something tangible and positive, especially because the priority are to green transition, to social inclusion, health resilience, vaccine, and so on. And also very important, and on this, I think that no other partner of the CELAC region has the equivalent, is the declaration on digital alliance, which is typical from the European value that apparently on this side, Latin America is sharing. So also positive, some agreement on cooperation in multilateral forum, but this is also very vague. Global peace and stability, trade, recovery, climate change, research, justice, security. This is, in terms of word, it's already something, but it remains very vague. There is also the recognition of the EU role to impulse worldwide a global energy transition. CELAC is supporting this EU leadership. This could be very important as a potential action. A lot of bilateral memorandum of understanding with some countries, essentially on energy cooperation for Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, also with Honduras, El Salvador, and Ecuador in the same area of climate change and digital agenda. Also, the European Investment Bank signed two important lending programs in renewable energy with Brazil and with Chile. There were also side meetings on the Venezuelan crisis, and some parallel events were selected, one among the youth and one from the firm with like something like a business summit. So the negative aspect, which, as I mentioned, are more important than the positive one, for me, is the fact that this bi-regional diplomacy in 24 years is still unable to propose a dynamic cooperation out of the typical traditional instrument which were presented precisely now by Andrea in a very nice presentation where we could see all the available tools, but the results, according to my criteria, are very poor. There are some results, but if you compare this with the importance of the tool, it's relatively disappointing. An aspect which is very worrying is the loss of share value. Personally, I consider that in the same paragraph of the joint declaration, to see the impossibility to make a reference to the Russian aggression to a sovereign country, and a few lines below in the same paragraph to recognize that CELAC is defending territorial integrity of all nations and sovereignty and accepting the United Nations principle, this is really hypocrisy. There is no other way to say that this is, for me, unacceptable when you pretend to share some value. Because clearly CELAC was choose a camp against the principle which make possible a peaceful cooperation and coexistence. So I am afraid that this will have a lot of very tragic consequences. For example, it apparently doesn't affect any of the CELAC country, the consequences of the Russian aggression on energy, on cereal embargo. Apparently, CELAC is supporting, except maybe Chile, is accepting such attitude from a big country against a smaller one. On top of that, I consider that there is really a very weak concrete agreement, because it's much about the same. Discourse, words, excellent intentions, but nothing new. Too general, too diplomatic, and just using spending. Of course, Latin America is very interested to get to reap some of this policy. For me, the core of the problem relies in the method. It's a totally diplomatic process, acting with a top-down way. Consequently, it's very bureaucratic because it depends essentially from the Commission. There is absolutely no effective participation of civil society. And the result is that the structural problems, especially of the CELAC region, in its, for example, in trade structure, this is still the same as when this kind of diplomacy was launched. So I observe an absence of what I name a dynamic cooperation between all the stakeholders, firms, administration, experts, civil society. There is absolutely nothing accompanying the diplomats. An emblematic aspect of this failure is the Mercosur agreement, which started to be discussed in the year 2000. And we are 24 years after in the same, exactly the same impossibility to decide, in spite of a lot of change in the world panorama. Well, with Mexico and Chile, it is not exactly the same because the agreement were put in place already 20 years ago, but the modernization, the updating of this agreement is still missing a full ratification. And now the academic summit, which is a parallel reality, contrary to the last two summit EU-LAC, this time there were an impossibility to be recognized by the regional summit. The academic summit took place, and this network participated actively with a seminar into this academic summit. Also, we participated to a joint declaration among all the academics present. This was addressed to the head of state, but absolutely no mention in the joint declaration. It was totally blocked, especially by the Commission, which doesn't recognize that the academic community could have a say. They explained to me, for example, that they could accept us under the condition that we would be under their total direction and criteria. So no autonomy for the academics, which is by definition an impossibility. This witnessed a lack of openness in the method and a real fear of a bottom-up process. And not only in the EU, but it is the same in the CELAC region. This is strange. So the responsibility of this failure is on both sides, especially because CELAC is unable to have a coordination. We already mentioned this yesterday. And also because the summits are used just for political interest and advantage. So the gap between the top leaders and the citizen remains absolutely too big. This is not democratic at all. And the result is the absence of progress toward strategic alliance. So what to do? No progress, method is wrong, agreement remains words, far from reality, except maybe on energy and infrastructure. It is excessively geopolitical. The fact to refuse the bottom-up proposed by the academics of both regions is emblematic of this fear of a democratization of the process. And precisely what the academic summit pretends to do is to provide a concrete proposal for the head of state to decide how to build a strategic alliance. Academics have a say into that for the technical aspect, and this was totally refused, contrary to the Declaration of Vienna in 2006 and contrary to the last summit in Brussels. And this is a shame for a community which represents 4 million of professors and close to 40 million of students. So this is an impressive tool which is totally neglected by both sides. So what to do, why and how to improve? This situation could be improved because
Richard, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just ask you to try to, I mean, it's hard to interrupt, but just to.
How many minutes do you give me? Sorry.
Yeah, well, 1 minute, is that okay?
1 minute. So what I propose is something very, very basic, is to create direct networks and to, by decision of the top level, to enable and responsible the direct network between national administration, between SMEs, between firms, between Chamber of Commerce, in order to create what I named the quadruple helix of innovation, which is the triple helix plus the openness to a regional and bi-regional aspect and dimension, because this creates the cooperative peer pressure pushing to innovation and cooperation. This is the way for democratization, which is needed for renewing the EU-CELAC relation. So I will stop here, but I have more in my presentation and I am available for discussion. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure we'll have time to, in the discussion later, to finalize some points. So we give now the floor to Detlef, please.
Good. Thank you very much for the invitation. I planned to come to Rio de Janeiro, but last week I was teaching in Salamanca and spent some days in Madrid, and I caught COVID there. So on Monday I had to cancel my trip. It was very hard for me, but so keep safe when you're traveling. The virus is still outside there. My thoughts will be perhaps be a little bit too Eurocentric, but to compensate, there will be also some Euro critical comments. I basically agree with what Christian had said, so there will be also some repetitions. For me, the EU-CELAC summit left mixed feelings, but it presents both also opportunities and challenges for both sides. I think it's positively to be noted that Latin American and European governments returned to dialogue at the highest level after 8-year pause, which was due more to the Latin American disunity than to the Europeans' lack of interest. Latin America was divided between right-wing and left-wing governments. The CELAC was temporarily paralyzed, and as you know, the Brazilian government did not participate in CELAC meetings until the end of 2022, when Bolsonaro left the office. The extensive 41-point final declaration did not leave aside any issue of the complex and broad bi-regional agenda, such as climate change, sustainable development, gender equality, protection and sustainable use of the oceans, access to drinking water, responsible digital transformation, social justice, and the fight against corruption and crime. It was a kind of stock-taking of possible fields for future cooperation. So the agenda seems to have added up in breadth, but not in depth, or even in strategic sense. The result is an extensive and challenging list of joint points on joint topics with no clear prioritization. I think this is less due to the lack of will than to the difficulty of aggregating the interests and priorities of a very large number of governments, with very different and often opposing political orientations and point of views. Moreover, we should not forget that there are structural problems on the Latin American side that makes it difficult to articulate a common agenda. Unlike Europe and the European Union, Latin America and the Caribbean are not represented by a regional organization, but by a regional forum, CELAC, which does not have a permanent secretariat or an independent administrative structure. At best, common positions are elaborated at annual president summits with little binding force for the participating governments. Structural deficits make it makes it difficult for Latin America to find a common position vis-a-vis the European Union. I think it was Julieta who mentioned yesterday the lack of activeness on the Latin American side, not only in the relations with the EU, but also in other issues. However, I think it's not only a structural problem, there is also a lack of consensus among Latin American governments on many economic and political issues, especially in international relations. Despite the reactivation of CELAC during Mexico's pro tempore presidency, Latin America's disunity persists. While Europe has a common position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Latin America has a variety of positions, ranging from unequivocal condemnation of Russia's to wavering over Russia's aggression to an openly pro-Russian stance, as in the case of Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Venezuela, and also Cuba. The increasingly isolated Nicaraguan regime, Ortega did not participate in this summit, managed to delay the adoption of a joint declaration because of the paragraph on the Ukrainian conflict, which in the end it did not accept. And in my opinion, aging Brazilian president took issue with a statement of his young Chilean counterpart, President Boric, who called the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine imperial aggression, accusing him of political inexperience at his first summit with the EU. Lula's behavior and that of the Nicaraguan regime are symptomatic for Latin America's disunity. At the same time, the joint declaration is an indicator of the heterogeneity of Latin America as a region and of the different national priorities, as it contains issues that are of particular importance to specific governments or subregions. It calls for lifting the embargo on Cuba, mentions the deterioration of public security and the humanitarian situation in Haiti, and reaffirms support for the peace process in Colombia. The declaration also encourages a constructive dialogue in the negotiations on Venezuela and Mexico City. On the question of sovereignty over the Malvinas Island, the final declaration states that the EU takes note of CELAC's historic position. This was considered a success by the Argentinian government. I think the UK government was not so happy. The declaration welcomes the progress in the processes of signing the modernized agreements with the EU and Chile and between the EU and Mexico, and takes note of the ongoing work on the EU-Mercosur agreement. Moreover, slavery is condemned as a crime against humanity, and reference is made to the Caribbean community's 10-point for restorative justice. Beyond the multiplicity of voices and interests on the Latin American side, EU and CELAC members reaffirmed their commitment to the fundamental principles of a multilateral order based on rules and binding agreements, including respect for territorial integrity, the principle of non-interference, the protection of human rights, the fight against corruption, the protection of the oceans, and climate protection. The joint declaration therefore provides a basis for future cooperation and coordination between the EU and Latin America in multilateral fora. This is important at a time when the multilateral order is being questioned and tribute is being paid to a multipolarity without guiding principles. However, the emphasis on shared principles regarding the design of the international order should not obscure differences in the interpretation and application of international norms. Coming back to the multiplicity of voices on the Latin American side, I argue that this leads to a differentiated response on the European side. Thus, the EU-CELAC summit also confirmed a tendency for the European Union to cooperate bilaterally rather than multilaterally with politically like-minded partners on a case-by-case basis on specific issues. The conflicting interests between the EU and some Latin American governments, but also within the CELAC, could lead in the future to an even greater bilateralization of EU-Latin American relations, as already demonstrated by the signing of bilateral memoranda with Chile and Uruguay during the summit in Brussels. I think also that Giulietta mentioned yesterday the more and more fragmented relationship between the EU and Latin America. I agree fully with this. The EU has been very willing in the joint declaration to reach out to Latin American positions to facilitate cooperation between the two regions. For example, by accepting the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, taking into account the respective capabilities to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change and environmental degradation. The fight against climate change, environmental protection, and the creation of sustainable supply chains lend themselves to closer multilateral cooperation between the European Union and Latin America. However, as the problems with the EU-Mercosur agreement demonstrate, this also requires cooperation on equal footing, which should not be characterized by the EU's mistrust in the fulfillment of agreements reached, as it now happens in the case of the EU-Mercosur agreement. From the European perspective, the passages of the text on the conflict in Ukraine in the joint declaration were rather disappointing, as Christian also mentioned. They show that there is no strategic partnership between the two regions in this existential issue for Europe. There's also a gap between Latin America and Europe about the protection of human rights and democracy. The joint summit declaration mentions the crimes of the past, slavery, but is silent about the crimes against human rights in the present. Given the situation in many Latin American countries, the reaffirmation of shared values regarding free and fair, inclusive, transparent, and credible elections seems for me to be very cynical. It was important for the European Union and CELAC governments to meet for dialogue, to identify common interests, but also to discuss controversial issues. However, the third EU-CELAC summit also showed that the two regions are still far from a common strategic vision in international politics. What exists are overlapping strategic interests in certain areas. There are also deficits in the Latin American consultation process. I mentioned the problems with CELAC as a forum, and there are profound disagreements between both regions in regard to the respective visions of the future world order. In sum, the two regions have yet to realize the full potential of their political, economic, cultural, and social ties. At the same time, geopolitical incentives for closer cooperation persist. Latin America needs Europe as a counterweight to China's growing influence and the ups and downs of US policy. And Europe needs like-minded partners in a world where geopolitical and geoeconomic parameters are shifting to its detriment. The success of the EU-CELAC summit will ultimately depend on which happens after the summit. In this respect, it is positive that the bi-regional agenda was continued immediately after the summit. Yesterday, the European Ministers of Justice and Home Affairs met in Brussels with colleagues from 14 Latin American countries to discuss closer cooperation in the fight against organized crime and drug trafficking. 2 weeks before, there was the first meeting of the EU-CELAC economy and finance ministers in Santiago de Compostela, co-organized by the Spanish presidency and the CAF Development Bank of Latin America. The ministers agreed to establish a monitoring and following up mechanism to successfully implement the Global Gateway Agenda, which foresees 45 billion euros for investment until 2022 to boost the green, digital, and social transformation of Latin America and the Caribbean. Before the EU-CELAC summit in Brussels, the EU had included Latin America in its Global Gateway program, thus also offering material incentives for closer cooperation. After all that has been said, a moment of truth for Europe is approaching. The EU-Mercosur agreement is at a critical stage. Mercosur has presented a counter-proposal to the European demands to strengthen environmental and climate standards, and the Paraguayan government, as the future pro tempore presidency of Mercosur, has increased the pressure on the EU by announcing that it does not want to negotiate further. The EU must decide whether it will finally sign the agreement or continue to pursue a morally dressed up protectionism. A failure of the agreement would weaken its geopolitical and geoeconomic position and undermine Europe's credibility in Latin America. The EU must overcome the contradiction between its grand geopolitical aspirations and both its parochial agricultural protectionism and its claim to moral superiority. For some of those responsible on the European side, I would recommend reading Max Weber again and looking at his distinction between the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility. We can defend the purity of our environmental standards and moral claims in Latin America and not sign the EU-Mercosur agreement, but at the same time lose opportunities to influence our environmental policies in Latin America. Whether this will really protect the climate and the environment better is more than questionable. Thank you very much for your attention, and I have to apologize once again for not being in Rio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Detlef, also for the punctuality. And we'll have a lot of food for thought, yeah, but we have a long table. And we have now, I have really the pleasure to give the floor to Ademar Mineiro, who has actually from the Brazilian civil society following these relations for ages. And I think he's the best person to give the equivalent overview from our civil society and NGOs. So please, Ademar, thank you very much for being here with us.
Okay. Andrea, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'll try to express some ideas we have discussed inside the REBRIP and some personal ideas on this issue. There are some of REBRIP is a network of civil society organizations, meaning some social movements and NGOs also, and some of the members of REBRIP participated in two forums in Brussels during the EU-LAC summit. First was the EU-LAC forum itself, and then the Stop EU-LAC forum that was organized by civil society organizations there. So some of the ideas I got from the experience of the members that participated in the meetings in Brussels. So just to begin, the final declaration of the summit seems to me very generic. In some points, almost mellifluous. I think there is this word in English also. And sometimes a sum up of parts of other UN and other multilateral declarations with no cohesion or a clear direction. So it's a kind of limit of the declaration, maybe after 8 years of no meetings, but we have to appoint that, I think. The other point is that discussions now are happening, well, after the pandemic and after this clear conflict between China and the US for world hegemony, and also taking into consideration the war in Ukraine, and issues like energy transition and the introduction of new technologies, including new materials based on rare minerals or artificial intelligence. So we are following relocations inside the international supply chains, and all that having this mentioned conflict between China and the US as a background. And in relation to this issue, both Latin American and the Caribbean countries, and also the European countries, must reposition themselves. So this is a kind of background of the meeting. Related to that, countries in Europe and also in the Latin America and the Caribbean are repositioning in different ways in this context. Some of them are more close to China, some of them more close to the US, and some of them having their own national and regional projects. So we have like 3 big sets of general positions on that. Well, having that in mind, I will explore, with the limit of time, just 3 points that appear in the final declaration. Speaking after 3 people, they also mentioned some of the points, so I will not be extensive relating to them. But the first related to peace and different priorities in international context, related to the proximity of Latin American and Caribbean countries, meaning geopolitical, but also economic, and also related to security issues. So some of the countries are more close to China and even to Russia. And this difference is also appearing among European countries. You can see in the recent period, for instance, the position of Poland in relation to the war in Ukraine. So they are also having splits in the position related to the war, as we have it also in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this is expressed in the final declaration, again, as a very mellifluous text on the war that was already mentioned. But I have to point that this is not from the side. It's not only from the side of Latin America and the Caribbean countries. It's also from the side of the European countries. They also have difference related to the position on the war. So I think that the final text of the declaration expresses somehow this difference between the 2 regions, but also among the countries inside the 2 regions. The second point relates to environment and climate issues. So, many of Latin American and Caribbean countries' economies are based on export of commodities, raw materials, extractivism in a common sense, and this including oil and gas, but not only that, including the expansion of agricultural areas, just for being a problem to the environment issues in the region, but also mining of lithium, for instance, that has many problems to the environment in the region, and this is somehow supported by the European Union inside the trade agreements that are being negotiated. So somehow I see as very confused the position on one side, very attached to the declarations on environment and climate, but on the other side, forcing trade agreements that are very critical to the environment in the region. And again, I see no coherence putting the two ideas again, together in the final declaration. As I think one of the colleagues that spoke before me said, the Latin American and Caribbean countries reinforced the idea of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. But when we look at the declaration, there's a lack of expressive money related to the transition. So I see this problem is also expressed in the final declaration. Finally, appears the issue of the global gateway investment agenda, and this is not a very simple issue, but the global gateway is an option related to the Belt and Road Initiative, meaning that expressing that the support to the global gateway in a final declaration between two different regions. Europe is forcing this kind of conflict with the China project, the Belt and Road Initiative, just making clear that the EU will dispute the hegemony in the area of Latin America and the Caribbean. I think the main point in common between the two regions in the final declaration is the support of multilateralism, and we can see that in many of the points of the final declaration. And I think this is the most important issue. Let's see if from this point and from more frequent meetings, as they are reaffirming that they will meet each 2 years from now on, the two regions can somehow get closer. And finally, I will mention the positions expressed in civil society meetings. Not only the EU-LAC official forum, but also in the parallel Stop EU-LAC forum. Civil society organizations expressed very critical positions related to trade agreements, to the ones that are very close to be operative, as Mexico and Chile, but also related to the EU-Mercosur discussions. These two meetings also make possible rebuilding the links between civil society organizations from the two sides of the Atlantic that were very strong in the first decade of this century, but after that, and especially after the crisis in 2008, get more weak. And reconstructing links between CSOs from the two sides in this new specific context is very provocative. And we have to follow what will happen and evaluate this process in the next years. But there was an important feeling of operating together again. And this is was very impressive to the ones that participated in the two forums, especially from the old ones that have been participating in the first decade of this century in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ademar. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions later as well. And now we'll have Carol Salgado, who is a professor here and researcher from the network, talking about health, and just as an issue that we have with COVID included, of course, the question of the COVID as a crime. Sorry, we included health not only in our research because of the COVID crisis, but also we were from the beginning planned in our project to study social policy. So health was simply reinforced, and Carol, who has been working with that since her PhD at least, it's the right person to talk about it now. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Andrea. I believe that what I will share with you is like showcasing what our previous 4 presentations said, what Ademar, Detlef, Andrea, and Christian said, in a sense of giving a case study. So I will not gonna touch on the topics our colleagues yesterday raised it here about intellectual property and the discussions more in an activist or more in a out of the partnership way. Yeah, I will focus just on the partnership and just on how this interregional cooperation in health is taking place since it began. Yeah, like so taking a little bit from what Andrea showed us, Andrea Biancoli showed us today. Maria, you help me with these lights, please. And I will have to be like this because just put in the second, please. What? Yes, maybe you want to exchange with me? Yeah. Yes, because then okay. Okay, so the EU-LAC, yeah, it's okay, fine. Go a little bit, yeah. So the EU, so the EU-LAC cooperation in health began in 2005, like Andrea showed us, because it's mainly part of the EU cohesion policy that embraces other areas, other policy areas, but in terms of health, it began with the Eurosocial Salud, yeah, that's the health part of the Eurosocial program from 2005 to 2009. It's part of this cohesion policy of the European Union, focusing on equity in the health status of individuals and access to services and treatments. So I'm not going to the deep details of each project, just to mention the main features of each one. So the second main one was the EU-LAC cooperation programs on drug policies, also mentioned by Andrea in her databases. It's a project that has 3 phases. It's actually in its third phase. So it began in 2011 and it's ongoing still. Each phase has 4 years. And it's promoting technical cooperation and political dialogue on drugs policies, also embracing narco traffickers and the combating of organized crimes in this region. So I would say it has a security tone together with the health focus. And the third one that seems to me the most robust, the strongest one is the EU-LAC Health, a roadmap for cooperative health research that took place between 2011 and 2017, focused on providing new insights into how to best coordinate and fund cooperative health research between the two regions. Key aspects was linking and coordinating two important policy areas, that was science and technology, plus international development cooperation. As we know, they are two main pillars of the partnership, science and technology, research and innovation, exchange of academics, and also the international development cooperation in many other policy areas that embraces in this priorities of the European Union when founding these projects and the partnership itself. Beside them, I also worked over our project, the years Jean Monnet took place with this multilateral engagement between the two regions. So they both took part in the Foreign Policy and Global Health Initiative that is known as the Oslo Group. This is an initiative launched in 2006 in New York, but since 2007, with the official declaration, the Oslo Ministerial Declaration, Global Health, a pressing foreign policy issue of our time, every year, the Oslo Group approves a resolution in the UN General Assembly. You can go to the next. And as sponsors or supporters, European Union and Latin American countries has been taking part and actively engaging in these resolutions every year. And in each of these 13 resolutions until 2020, we had them approved by the Oslo Group. And then analyzing all of them, the content, the proposals, the topics, the focus of each of these resolutions, plus the memorandum of understandings and the communications meetings of them. And then I can say that the priority was given to different dimensions of development through health, such as social cohesion and health equity, technical assistance and political dialogue on drugs policies, and strengthening health in research and innovation collaboration. Social development was indeed the main locus within which both regions find consensus and achieve significant outputs for global governance for health. This can be seen both in the bilateral and in the multilateral engagement of the regions. And the patterns of EU-LAC cooperation in health were in practice aligned with their multilateral engagement in the UN. So not only in the General Assembly, but other UN forums and in declarations for the occasions of EU-LAC summits over this period, since 2005 until the current one in 2023. Foreign policy and technical cooperation have historically been favoring interregional governance for health, but after the pandemic, I would say something has changed. As our colleagues already mentioned, the summit was not so, we were not so optimistic after the summit, but I would say the main change was not highlighted in the declaration, but in EU documents. So next one, please. So as we know, the EU launched this global gateway in 2021 that will prioritize the security of pharmaceutical supply chains and the development of local manufacturing. But health issues extend beyond the pandemic. So the global gateway will also facilitate investment and infrastructure and the regulatory environment for the local production of medicine and medical technologies. Besides the Global Gateway, the EU also launched the Global Health Strategy Report, in which we read that the first two essential priorities are investing in well-being of all people and reaching universal health coverage with stronger health system. The third core priority is combating current and future health threats, which also requires a new focus. It calls for enhanced equity in the access to vaccines and other countermeasures for a One Health approach. So we clearly see that regarding to health policy, the focus, the priority, and the issue where the European Union will put more attention and more money is the manufacturing of medical technologies and drugs. Let's go to the next one. Therefore, which kind of change can in the EU-LAC interregional cooperation in health pushed by the Global Gateway and the Global Health Strategy can we expect? So far, we have 3 concrete initiatives with CELAC that were announced by the DG International Partnership. So after this document, the Gateway and the report, we have 3 announcements by the DG, one in June last year and 2 this year in March and July. So I would just focus on the first one because I saw that the second and the third were developments of the first. So we actually have one big announcement to put in practice to implement the priorities that we saw in the documents. That's exactly this one, a EU-Latin American Caribbean partnership on manufacturing vaccines, medicines, and health technologies, and strengthening health systems. So the second one was a high-level pharmaceutical forum to promote local manufacturing. And the third one was a partnership for improving LAC health technologies with the Pan American Health Organization. This last one emerged from the EU-LAC summit in July this year. Next one, please. Some insights and ideas about these announcements made by the European Union are not difficult to imagine that the kind of change in the EU-LAC interregional cooperation in health this time clearly reflects the dominance of EU interests, and we discussed a lot of these interests yesterday, so I will not repeat them. The main locals moved from development through health, that was what we saw in at least in the 3 previous projects until pandemic, to an economic-driven health development, because it focused, like the main partner of this initiative is the pharmaceutical sector. The pharmaceutical sector that is the richest and the major contributor of EU economy inside the European Union. So this is a movement clearly propelled by the EU by means of elevating health technologies and manufacturers as priorities, despite knowing the huge structural difference between both regions in this regard. And I will not go deeper in this difference because we know them very well, but first and foremost, health technologies and manufacturing in CELAC are mainly conducted with public investment and in public institutions, while in the EU, the field is dominated by the big pharma that are private transnational companies that count on EU subsidies and normative facilities. I would say that it's historically that the main contradictory topic between inside this partnership, but between some countries of both regions, is the dispute between trade and profits on the one hand and health on the other hand. This has been taking place since at least the beginning of the 20th century. So within the multilateral system, WHO, within the partnership itself. So the crucial question is, how will the EU operationalize the support of regional and country efforts in Latin American Caribbean to strengthen the pharmaceutical systems and manufacture capacities for vaccines and other medical products technologies without harnessing the European pharma sector's profits and interests? This is a crucial sector for the EU economy, and this is recognized in the 2020 pharmaceutical strategy for Europe that was already concerned with this. Like the interests and profits at stake here are not small and are not marginal in this discussion, at the same time that they are very much organized as a private sector within the Union that makes a lot of lobby, a lot of pressure, and has an agenda, very concrete agenda of interests that include subsidies and normative facilities that they usually get from the EU. So to conclude, the next one, please. The history of implementation of common projects shows that they were successful despite disagreements in how both regions understand health. So I put this because I don't want to say that disagreements just began or that this is a new feature of the partnership. Throughout all the projects since before pandemic, disagreements were there. This is normal in any partnership, and they could implement these projects despite these disagreements. So actors in both regions have learned how to adapt to each other without huge losses for their people. They will draw their own preference for the cooperation in manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and health technologies. I think CELAC has much to gain in centralizing the engagement of the Pan-American Health Organization and CEPAL, the Commission of Economic Policies in Latin America, in joint initiatives with the European private sector. So I saw this in practice through my research about the COPOLAD program that were full of controversial topics too, and they also tried to manage. So I don't think this is new for the actors that engage in the partnership, but it remains to be seen the power of an economic-driven health agenda as the new locus of their cooperation to define how, instead of just what, competing interests and capacities will be accommodated. I live here because we need like time to discuss. Yeah, so many details I could put on the table, but I think better to take the word to Nicola to give the word. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, I'm gonna set a timer because when I talk about this, I get excited. Oh yeah, sorry. So my name is Nicola Bilotta. I was a former senior fellow at Istituto Affari Internazionali, and now I'm the coordinator of a European project at the European University Institute on Digital Finance. So put a timer, 8 minutes, so we have time for discussion. First of all, a small game for you. Who said these words? Every night I ask myself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar. Why can't we do trade based on our own currency? Who said these words? Lula, yes, fantastic. Okay, so normally when I go sleeping, I think about what I'm gonna have for lunch the next day, but I guess Lula has different constraints. So when we talk about the current international monetary system, we are talking about a system that is dominated by the US dollar and by the US-led system, infrastructure, and settlement. In the last 20 years, there were been several attempts by the European Union, by China, to try to, to mitigate the role of the US dollar. And they all have failed miserably, I would also say. So the power of the US dollar in the world economy seems, unbeatable. It is true? Maybe not. We are now at a crossroad because we have the interlink between three dynamics that could change and could shape the future of the international monetary system. And we know that the baseline of the international monetary system is a reflection of a geoeconomic balance of power. Before the US, the international currency was the pound. So the world is changing. Therefore, also the international monetary system will change. How? That is the key question. So first, which are the three interlinked dynamics that are shaping the world economy? Economic dislocation, geopolitical tensions, and digitalization. Economic dislocation. If you take in account the 25 non-aligned countries, which basically the definition is countries that do not impose sanctions against Russia, and they have not taken a standing in the tension between China and the US, they count for 18% of the global GDP. The European Union counts for 14. So just to make you an idea, we are in a completely different world economy. Indonesia is now in the global supply chain, most likely more important than Italy. And if you see GDP forecasting, you will see that the global economy is going to change. Second, geopolitical tension. We have now, like if you look at the, political economy, academics, they are getting again this idea that geopolitics actually count. For years, we were driven by a foreign policy, which is basically based on economic efficiency. And we have seen with Germany and foreign policy in Russia, right? It was about energy supply, cheap energy supply, without taking account geopolitical risks. This has changed. Third one, digitalization. Digitalization is everywhere. It's also in the international monetary system. So I go back to school, guys. Which are the three functions of an international currencies? Store of value. So you go to your bank, you leave the money. Payment, a unit of account. In the past, one currency was a currency only if it was taking these three functions. Right now, it's not the same. There is what we call the unbundling of function. So you can use a currency only for a specific purpose. And we also see it in the international monetary system with huge reflection in terms of how we use an international currency. And why digitalization is playing a key role. In the 90s, 70% of the foreign currency reserves were in the US dollar. Today is 59. Why? Because now we have digital trading platforms that makes very easy for private and public entities to diversify their portfolio. So they can reduce management risk by acquiring different kind of currencies. And you will say, most likely it's going to be China. People are buying yuan. Actually not. If you see how this aggregation is composed, you will see that most of the new currencies that have been bought are from Canada, from South Korea. So very stable economy. I mean, I would not say small, but still not super, like major. And in the past, banks or states would not acquire this currency because it was difficult, it was expensive. Nowadays, it's super easy. So it's a trend that is, is taking place and is gonna continue. And why? Do you know that the US has increased the use of financial sanction by 933% from 2000 to 2023? So of course, every country was like, oh, okay, whoa, what is happening if they're gonna impose a sanction to me? Right? This is a de-risking strategy. Trying to reduce the dependency from the US dollar is a de-risking strategy. So you're gonna tell me, of course, the BRICS has announced that they're gonna launch their own currency. Brazil and Argentina has announced, oh, we are gonna launch a common currency. This is not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen, not at all. What is happening is a gradual fragmentation. So what we are observing is that the multipolarization that we can observe in international affairs is also slowing, reflecting this trend in the international monetary system. But there is something, sounds futuristic, but there is something that is going to completely change the future. And this, the central bank digital currency. I know this word sounds weird and probably maybe you didn't hear. It's very simple. Basically, it's creating a digital currency. It's not going to be Bitcoin, huh? It's going to be like buying your euro, your dollar, your realis, yeah? Drex, wow, super cool name to attract young people. And basically, it's just gonna, you're gonna have, instead of physical cash, you're gonna have virtual cash. So you're gonna use your phone as you use Google Pay, Apple Pay, Mercado Libre, Mercado Pago, whatever it is. You take your phone and you pay. The same. It's a matter of fallibility. So this is a discussion for boring experts. But basically, it's a matter of fallibility. So the central bank is issuing this virtual money and not commercial banks. Boring. Go back to the exciting part. Why are we talking about cooperation between the European Union and, let's say, LATAM? Because right now is a phase where countries are experimenting this new technology. Because in the end, for us, is using virtual cash. But what matters is the underlying infrastructure. Again, very boring, but when now you go to Italy and you withdraw money with your Brazilian credit card, there is a back system that allows you to do it. It's called correspondent in banking. When CBDC are going to be in place, if multilateral arrangements are going to be in place, central banks will be able to talk to each other and make easier, cheaper, and faster international transaction. But to actually mitigate, to actually achieve this objective, you need cooperation. Because basically our infrastructure, they need to speak the same language. 2 minutes, 8 minutes or 2 minutes. Why now we are in a crossroad? You know who is leading the race towards the CBDC? Of course, our friends from China. They have launched what they call a pilot digital one that is involving more or less 120 million retail users and more than 40 million corporate users. And they're trying to sell their technology. So this is very important, because if it's a discussion of infrastructure, digital infrastructure, about protocols, about, let's say, language, if you decide to adapt the technology provided by a third country, you are also setting the standard that that country is setting in terms of privacy, in terms of economic efficiency. So the question for me now is, how do Latin countries want to position themselves in the world economy? Would you like, guys, to have an infrastructure that is shared in terms of protocol and rules developed by China? Or do you prefer to actually have a dialogue with the European Union and trying to set global standards that actually have what we saw before, a human-centric technology? So this is my discussion. I know that this point is not in the agenda. It's not at all in the agenda. It's not even in our digital Euro agenda. Huh? But it's something that we need to talk about it now, because it's now that we're building the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure that are going to support the future of CBDC. And CBDCs are arriving like winter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I was exactly on giving you the micro, going to say that this topic, being one of the oranges of this research group, the relationship between financial crisis and democracy, one of the issues that we engaged in was exactly these new digital currencies. We have a couple of webinars, and Nicola has been working on that. And we thought we actually working more even, and maybe Tuca can do a question later, because we know that in the case of Brazil, there's also a newly announced DRIX. So maybe we can discuss that. So that's the connection. And like as Bilota said, it's not yet in the agenda, but perhaps there is a common interest here. And that's exactly the point, now how our Latin American countries position. So it's a lot, very rich. I opened the floor before bringing some elements to give the chance for people to bring. And of course, anyway, this will continue after this roughly whatever half an hour that we have, because I think it's, if we think from the beginning, now from Andrea's presentation, we have this so broad overview of EU-Latin American relations, and with the case, the case of health, that, as I think also Carol said, it's much more than the two declarations. Actually, we have to follow that closer. This roadmap, I think Detlef was saying, and also Christian, about this, the meetings that are supposed to take place. I would be interested to know about these meetings. I think a lot of transparency should maybe be facilitate the engagement of civil society and academics. But anyway, let's see. I mean, questions from the public, and then we do another round.
Well, hello. Thank you all for your presentations. I'm Julieta Selikovic. It was really exciting to hear all the trip we made from the general ideas to the very specific agendas. But I had a question related to Andrea's and Christian's presentation, that when we saw these agreements and all the process and actors involved in EU-LAC governance, what I was thinking about is how we can explain that, for example, in these agreements, in the FTAs, the pillars of political dialogue and cooperation are not enforced due to the lack of support of national governments, actually national parliaments. So how is this difference, or this lack of interest of local governments in the European Union? having an impact in the EU-LAC Latin American relationship. There is another, how you say, another capa, another layer, another layer of actors that are relevant and we haven't mentioned yet. And well, I would like to hear of you that you are the experts on the European side. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Amanda Cruz. I'm a master's student here in PUC, and I would like to ask mostly for Christian and also Ademar about the positioning of civil society organizations. So on the one hand, Christian brought us the criticism of top-down decisions and pointing out the importance of increasing the civil society organization, the participation. So I'd like to listen more about how do you imagine that we could bring this and as an institutionalization of those organizations, how would it be to increase this participation, pointing out the importance, and bringing to you, Ademar, as you pointed out, how they were positive about the Brussels summit, and thinking more from the inside, how do you see the social organizations talking about this increasing of participation, how in this point of the experience, how this participation could be even more present? And thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. I want just to say that I couldn't agree more with you. I think this is the point. I mean, this is the crucial issue about what international scheme are the countries going to decide to join. And like we have M-Bridge, if you want to say something about that. And precisely, you were not in our seminar in Athens, but one of our colleagues presented the discussion in Latin America about the common currencies, etc. And I precisely agree that it's no way, it's exactly what you said. There's no reason to have a common currency. There's no way to build one now, because we have these other ways to go through. And when Lula says that, I think he knows, actually, he does know. There could be like a set of contracts signed by different countries, even within the BRICS Development Bank, even if the BRICS actually got bigger with these new countries. And I think it's very hard for me, even being an economist, it's very hard to engage in this technological discussion, because we don't know. I don't know about computers and programming, etc. But we need to, and there's like DLT, or I don't know, all the systems that could be used. And I think it's also for the region integration, not only in Latin America, but the conversation between the two regions, that's crucial.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I'm Dimitris Katsikas from the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. More of a comment, but also sort of question towards everybody. I think already for the presentations today, somebody who knew nothing about the summit wouldn't be surprised why there was not major progress. Because already among the experts and academics coming from EU and Latin America, it's clear that there's difference of views. I think for me, it's very striking. And I think this links also to the last comment of Nicola about the digital currencies, but also what Christian said and other speakers. I mean, this era is different than previous eras. In the Cold War, you had a hegemon, but it was a pretty cut system which all participating countries shared some basic values. The other part was isolated. Even the same could be said about the British era. They had the gold standard, everybody that mattered were part of that system. Today, we have a much more interconnected economy, but you have major players linked to each other which do not share the same basic values. China does not share the same basic values as the West. So, you know, other countries like Latin American countries, big countries, big players like Brazil, you know, in the eyes of the West and you have to take a stance. I mean, currently many foreign policy analyses, some people say this is a good time from countries like Brazil because they get to play against each other, the other players, the three big blocks and gain more. But I think this is going to be increasingly difficult because it's very difficult to disentangle this interconnectedness, particularly with new technologies, from most basic fundamental principles and values. And we can see that in the declaration and the treatment of the war, the invasion of Russia and Ukraine. I don't agree with the assessment that Europe has a split view on that. I think Europe has a very clear stance and policy on the Ukraine war. Of course, there are different views within the EU, but you know, this is true about everything. So I'd like your views about how we're going forward, because this is not going to go away. It's going to become worse and worse, I think, as time goes by.
Yes, my name is Bettina de Souza Guilherme, and I'm also an EUI fellow, and I'm on a leave from the European Parliament. And my thoughts or my reflections after the discussion go quite in the same direction, because the perception was like a big disappointment about the EU-LAC meeting, the content, and also the way of the decision-taking process. And then my thought was that perhaps it is also related to this clash of our conceptions of regionalism and the way we take decisions, which is in the European Union a much more supranational way, and in Latin America much more on national sovereignty based. And there I have a disagreement a bit with no, I forgot Detlef, yeah, because I think that also the EU-Mercosur deal is not only about protectionism, it's also coming from the European Parliament about the democratic decision-taking process. And there we see that maybe there is a mistake in the way these negotiations are being done. Perhaps, for example, European Parliament has the right to agree, and otherwise it's not being ratified, yeah? So it should have been much earlier being involved in the negotiation, informed, involved, and perhaps make the decision before it signed these agreements, yeah? Because now we are in a situation that the Parliament has actually already said, no, not in this way, there needs to be reinforcements in environmental aspects. And that gives now this clash that from Latin America, this is now seen as a kind of, yeah, maybe again, imperialism from former colonialist forces, yeah, and from the culture that with the strong national sovereignty, of course, clashing with that kind of tradition here, yeah, while in Europe, it's clashing with our democratic decision-taking process. So I think this aspect has to be also considered here, yeah.
Thank you all. I make some comments also, and then we give the floor on the other around. I think one point about this geopolitical context, because we started the conference yesterday talking about that, and we had even the Brazilian ambassador who is in the Ministry of External Relations, the director for the Europe and Latin America. And we heard from her, but also in the discussion, and we are reading a lot about it, that it's from the global South perspective, and here I mean not economics and so on, but really like comparing with the Cold War, that countries who were not in the center of either the Soviet Union or the well, or the West, so to speak, and that's pretty much the case of Latin America. We ask all the time, I mean, this position, and a lot of countries are discussing about this active non-alignment. And this is, I think, the case of Brazil and BRICS. I mean, that's also it's an alternative, this active non-alignment. And I think for Brazil, this has been the discussion, not only about in the Ministry of External Relations and but in the society is very divided. And I think this is important. That's something that I think it's important for us as academics, that the government's position is not necessarily reflects the society. I mean, it should, or sometimes it does or not, but a long time after people are elected, you start having, again, all the debate and conflicts. And I think as academics, we have to open up this, because if you just say Brazil says that, this is very baseline, and also because we know officially sometimes they say something and it's not exactly like that. So I think on that discussion of values, I think we in Brazil went through 4 years that every single person thought about values every day, either on one side or the other. But I don't think that it's a lack of values or democracy or whatever. It's constraints, it's very structural constraints. And here not governments as such, because they also have domestic lobbies and all the, in the case of Brazil, agribusiness lobby. We talk a lot about pharmaceutics in Europe, but there's also pharmaceutics action in Brazil and also the agribusiness. So it's much more complex, but I think we should avoid making that black boxes, because from our perspective, that's the realest thing, that we just talk about a country as if it was one single person and everyone agreed. And exactly in those times of polarizations, I think every single issue that we're discussing, we find at least 2, 3, 4 positions. And I think this is important for us not to open up that. And just one more to connect with the bottom up, that we find it extremely important. We've been discussing that also in the context of the project, the engagement of civil society and of course, but to talk, to discuss, to bring solutions, not only complain. But that has been also complex, because as even Ademir said, and that's a question already for you, you said there was the group that went to the forum and the group that went to the stop the forum. So maybe you can say a bit more about that, because we know that strategy of advocacy, sometimes they block and sometimes they engage. And how is that perceived from the civil society? Because this is related to democracy too. I mean, if you try, don't manage, you give up. Or how is that in the EU-LAC specifically? And just to, if you can also make connect that to the youth, because also in democratic crisis, we see that the youth are very much the case in Latin America, but I suspect Europe too, who is electing for sometimes extreme parties. And if we don't do this bridge, I mean, you think that we'll talk about the different age perhaps. And finally about health, Carol, if you could say a little bit more about how this local, because it is, the word is that, the local production. And since yesterday, we've been talking about how can countries who are becoming more and more dependent on exports build value chains, give opportunities of jobs that are better paid. And it's obviously by building. Well, the word industrialization doesn't mean like they're becoming protectionist, or it means that you must provide jobs, at least at the bottom line. And in the case, for instance, medicine, if there's a lack of medicine and you have to have the minimum base for your population. But how is that framed? Because I know that CELAC and CEPAL, they did a project, and I understand that they use support in that project. So I don't know, maybe it's just a question. And yeah, so I think we start for a last round of word. Can we start then, Nicola, with you, and then we go? Thank you.
Yes, fantastic. On the question, so basically, yes, so there are a few experiments going around the world where central banks are cooperating to understand how we can settle, let's say, this international transaction through this new CBDC system. There are many projects actually. There is Bridge, there is Icebreaker, Project Mariana. And what happened is that also in this case, China is taking the lead. So China is promoting many experiments with other countries strategically, because the main objective, the main ambition is to set global standards, which is the major issue here, is deciding the rules of the game. In technology, standards are everything, are about how governments can store your transactional data. When you pay with cash, nobody see. When you pay electronically, you leave a track. And if you start paying everything with this CBDC, technically speaking, the government could access all your information. So there is a major issue in these CBDC projects, which is privacy in payments, which is a democratic right, because tomorrow, if you have a CBDC system connected to, let's say, an autocratic government, you go in a strike, they can freeze your account in 1 sec, because it's linked to a liability of the central bank. That is why I think it's a crucial issue, and that is why it should be also top in the agenda of our countries, because there is a stake in democracy here. Because maybe now nobody cares, but what if tomorrow you have an autocratic government in Europe or Latin America?
Yes, I will be very brief. Just one example of agreeing with what Dimitri just raised. It like I think values are always there, as Andrea said, but sometimes I see that private interests represent better like the values of a group, and sometimes it can be a little bit more schemed. Like just to illustrate what I'm saying, we know since ever that the EU power in trade is very huge, and the EU leverage this power, but until pandemic, at least in the health sector within the EU-LAC partnership, this was like more used to put political goals, social goals, so like development cooperation, social cohesion, research and innovation. And now we see that the economic power is being reinforced to leverage the private interests of pharmaceutics, but in extent to that will clash the EU values as a group, because like to continue answering what Andrea said, precisely the name of CELAC and CEPAL Declaration on Health is Plan on Health Self-Sufficiency. So like what CEPAL and the Pan American Health Organization are highlighting is what Latin American Caribbean countries want is self-sufficient, is sovereignty on whatever it means regarding health technologies, vaccines, and medicines. And in this meeting with the Pharmaceutical Forum that took place just in March this year, the private and the pharmaceutical sector of the European Union said, okay, you want sovereignty, you want self-sufficient, but we will not give up intellectual property. We will not give up patents. We will not give up like things that the European Union used to back. We used to give them. So like, I see that there are few values on the table, and the EU has been having difficulties to manage, to accommodate. Like, I believe on the one side, as Andrea said, it's not just one block of interests and values. On the one side, the European Union needs to strengthen the sovereignty and self-sufficient of CELAC countries, because pandemic can be back, other pandemics, but on the other side, the Pharmaceutical Forum is like our agribusiness here. It's a huge lobby. It's very difficult to negotiate even small steps, small changes with them. So I think the Commission, the DG International Partnership is in this like difficult place to negotiate with both sides. I really don't know, because CEPAL and the Pan American Health Organizations are saying, in order to put the minimum standards of this proposal in place, like to implement them, we need to negotiate things that are at the center of historical disputes between the two regions. That is the intervention that some countries do in airports and ports when generics are in transit, for instance, like dispute settlement agreements within the WTO, like since 2009 at least, many Brazil, India, and other bilateral and interregional dispute settlements are taking place. So this is not new. I mean, this is not just because of the pandemic. HIV was the starting point of this discussion. So like, and the European Union historically has been reducing this power to using more power through trade. And what we see now is like power 2 is back to enforce these interests, but we don't know how this will be implemented, because on the other side, we are strong too. I mean, Latin America is historically has a protagonism in health and like this since centuries, and is not willing to like negotiate key points, like sovereign, self-sufficient, and like universal health coverage like we have in Brazil, that is HIV, for instance, is for free. So we will not give up this. We will not put this on the table to negotiate. So it's hard, I would say, Andrea. I don't know how local production, value chains, job medicines, all of these are being discussed. All of these are like priorities. But at the same time, the pharmaceutics in Europe and the health ministry in Brazil, for instance, are like, okay, so how? Yeah, how are we gonna even start to talk about this in practice, and not just in terms of values and interests, like in terms more abstract. Yeah, it's this. It's just recently. We don't know. We have to follow a little bit more.
Okay, I'll refer to Amanda and Andrea questions. I think the main issue is that many of the civil society organizations, they seem uncomfortable to participate in the official forum. And also some governments are uncomfortable to have the civil society organizations. I think the main issue is autonomy. So some, especially the big organizations, like for instance, trade unions, big environmental organizations like Greenpeace, or big development organizations like Oxfam, they negotiate the institutional participation before being inside. On the other side, you have very small groups that are very attached to their autonomy, and they don't have the possibility of negotiating before the organization of the institutional meeting. So they prefer to retain their autonomy and organize something different. This is the case of gender organizations. This is the case of family farms organizations. But it's also an important issue to small, micro, and medium enterprises. So they don't have the possibility to institutionally negotiate their participation before, and they even have problems with money to participate in the meeting. They can't afford for the tickets, the hotels, and things like that. So they want to avoid that dependence to the states, to the national states, and so they prefer to participate in their own organized meetings. So I think that the issue of autonomy, and also the governments are very uncomfortable to the participation of some organizations. Those specific movements that are very aggressive in some issues internally, but also regional organizations, like Organization for Catalonia in Europe. The Spanish government doesn't want them to participate in some institutional spaces. So I think this is the question, the issue of autonomy. How you can guarantee to the organizations that if they participate in a forum, they can guarantee they can have guaranteed their autonomy, and so they will be more comfortable in discussing on that. If the governments put more limits to the autonomy of the organizations, they will prefer to participate in what they call the civil society counter summits and others like that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So now it was Detlef, no?
Yes, some comments. There was this question about the role of the European Parliament in the negotiations between the EU and the Mercosur. I think the main problem consists in the fact that the negotiations concluded in 2019, and then a new European Parliament was elected. And I think that's the problem. So we had a different composition of the parliament, but the negotiations closed, and this has created a lot of problems afterwards. And I think we should also speak again about the double standards. I think in the end, if the EU-Mercosur agreement will not be signed by the government of France, it will not be due to the protection of the environment of the Amazon. It will be due to the protection of the French agriculture. So we have this double standards in our argumentation. Coming to the question why, I think it was the question of Giulietta, why the political component of some of the EU agreements have not been ratified. I think we have too many veto players in Europe. We have 27 parliaments, and in some countries also the parliaments have two chambers, and in some cases also the regional parliaments have to ratify the agreement. And this gives a lot of space for veto play. I think Christian might explain us why, how it works in Belgium with the national parliaments, 3 regional parliaments, and why Wallonia has some problems ratifying some of the agreements. I think this is more a topic for specialists on Belgium and not on EU Latin American relations. Regarding the geopolitical context, I think listening to Latin American governments, I hear a lot about a more multipolar order and reducing also the influence on the West. Okay, I can live with this, but there's much less discussion about what are the rules of this new multipolar order. I think this is the important point, which will be the rules of this multipolar order. And therefore also this concept of non-active alignment, I think there's a lot also of double standards. I think you can justify as Brazilian government not to give ammunition for German anti-air tanks to Ukraine, but you cannot invite in the other week Iranian warships to the port of Rio de Janeiro. I think this is not really active non-alignment. This is a kind of half alignment with one side in the conflicts. And I think it's the same. You cannot condemn Russia in the UN Assembly, and then the next day you go back to business as usual. It's the same when your neighbor is assaulted. You say, okay, this was an assault, but then you invite the assaulter to having dinner with you the next day. So I think that I see there is a certain contradiction, and in some cases I think there was this very famous concept by Carlos Escudé from the 1990s of the peripheric realism, looking at the foreign policy of some Latin American countries. I think it's now changing more to some kind of peripheric opportunism, taking the opportunities if there are any, but without any clear principles. So this is my short commentary.
Christian?
Yes, thanks, Andrea. I was asked about the method at the beginning of the question time. So for the method that I had no time to explain, my proposal is very simple, is just to combine the top-down by the decision maker, because they are the legitimate authority for taking decision, but they are absolutely not competent for taking decision in knowledge economy. Now we are moving with digital aspect, and the kind of problem of global program we have to face, it is very important to speed up the diffusion of knowledge. This is the best way to ensure democracy and to fight populism, is to to bet upon the university, for example, because here the important is not to who is able to get a Nobel Prize, but who is able to diffuse knowledge in the whole society and to make them to help at the local aspect. So for that, my proposal is that, for example, the head of state and government should ask in parallel to let their national administration to be put in free network among themselves and close the door, of course, for asking them to look for common interests. Just that. On the technical aspect, what are our common interests? I know that this does work. I draw this from my own experience, not just inside the European Commission, for example, with the Monetary Committee, which was closed the door and with free ability to speak behind closed door in order to prepare a proposal of decision for the above level, for the minister or the head of state. This would be the very efficient way to dynamize, to make more dynamic the diplomatic summit. Diplomats have to decide with their minister or their head of state, but in a later stage. Now, from what I observed during 2 decades of summit between EU and CELAC, is that diplomats are blocking the initiative because they are, this is their role, they are just starting to fight for defending national interests, even in the EU. This is not true that the EU is speaking with one voice. This is a myth. In reality, for example, in these summit, bi-regional summit, national diplomats and national ministers are fighting for defending their own interests. And so they are trapped into the so-called prisoner dilemma, while the experts behind closed door are able to identify where they are stronger together. What are the common interests? Let's take the example of the international monetary system. I am absolutely sure that if you put the experts from Latin America and Europe close the door and speaking how to make the system to be improved and more stable, you could have very important proposals, not decision. This is not their role to decide. This is their role to promote initiative and to submit them, to submit their proposal to the legitimate decision maker. So, and as I already spoke about international monetary system, let me just to add to what Nicolas said, the fact that it is not by creating, for example, a common currency for the BRICS or for Latin America that you could move up the international monetary system. It's a little bit technical, but I am working on this for 50 years, starting with Robert Triffin and continuing with in my other association to fight for improving the international monetary system. There is a single and unique way to do that is with the SDR, the special drawing rights. This is the common currency, which would be the solution, because with a national currency used internationally, you cannot have macroeconomic and financial stability. And it will be about to get worse if, for example, new competitor of the dollar would be, for example, if China or Brazil or India would like to make their currency an international competitor of the dollar, this would be even more unstable. This is impossible for technical reasons. Just an example, you need to play this role with a national currency, you need to accept a permanent important deficit in your balance of payment. And so, for example, China, which has a big surplus, is unable to provide that. And their currency is even not fully convertible. So not to speak about Brazil or other. So, but what would be a positive aspect would be if Brazil and the BRICS would use SDR. This is a way to reduce the role of the dollar and to improve the stability of the world system and of the global liquidity, because SDR is not the currency of a single economy. So it is not a debt, a net debt, while with the dollar, you oblige the US to be in a growing net debt financially. So the US is the most...
Sorry to interrupt. No, I'm sure we'll continue discussing that,
okay.
But just if you can close down, because we are already half an hour, I think, late.
Good, okay.
Oh, well, we can have a kind of a...
What?
All right,
One thing.
well. So, Andrea.
Okay, I'm standing before your lunch. Okay, I'll do it quickly. So I start with Julieta's comment question. So in fact, in this database, we have not looked into the negotiation process, the whole process leading to the signature of the agreements, because that would be a different type of analysis. I have done research on negotiations between the European Union and Latin America. And I would say that the difficulties has to do with several aspects related to the European Union, but also to Latin America, of course. The first one has to do with the changes in EU trade policy, as I've mentioned before, in terms of who has a say in the final decision regarding trade agreements and the involvement of national and subnational parliaments, right? Though this works differently for different countries, to my understanding, because I'm not an expert on EU policy making and decision processes. And also going back to Bettina, I think that there is another issue. So why the parliament was not involved earlier when negotiations were relaunched? The question is, why did the European Commission continue the negotiation with Mercosur with a 1999 mandate? It was very clear that they didn't want to open this box because it had taken ages to bring countries together on a negotiating mandate in 1999. Imagine now with 27 countries, right? Or 26 because of Brexit. Okay, you do the maths. So I think that there are problems from a Latin American perspective in terms of difficulties to come together with a common position, but there are also some difficulties with the European Union in terms of veto players, just as Detlef was saying, but also in terms of preferences between different actors like the European trade area and the parliament and other actors. Having said that, it's true that because of the increasing complexity of the agendas, these trade agendas specifically do impact on the interests of a larger array of actors, because these agendas affect domestic regulatory governance. But now that, wait a minute, Ademar was talking about civil society participation. So the world of the 1990s and trade negotiations during the 1990s, at least in South America, were completely different, right? So we had the large anti-ALCA mobilizations, etc., something that you didn't see. And in terms of civil society participation, with all its limitations, even the FTAA opened some space in the Summit of the Americas, something that we didn't see when the European Union was negotiating the latest large trade agreement, right? So if you wanted to participate, you would have to go into an office with nothing, no pen, no phone, no nothing, and see what was going on. And going back also to Andrea's comment in terms of the need to go beyond declarations, I don't want to be here like a silly optimist, but I do think that I agree with this comment, because I think we do need to have a look. This would be more qualitative to see what happens when cameras go off, when governments go back, because there is a day-to-day dynamic in inter-regional relations that remain totally obscure, right? So I have not talked about the networks we have identified, but some of these networks bring specialists in different policy areas, including transparency, taxation, and these networks are a product of programs like Eurosocial. So it would be interesting to see what's going on beyond all these formalities, right? And I think I can leave it there. Thank you.
Andrea, well, I'll try to wrap up, but I just want to make one substantive comment. It's about the question, both of contradictions and autonomy, and then also, well, the opportunism. I think they're all hanging in the air. And I think in a way, all these elements, I think they reflect that we live in times of democratic instability. In the sense, we do have polarization. We do have difficult sometimes of our governments to keep their promises. We know, like at least the case of Brazil that we are following, it's a broad coalition with everyone else, everyone basically that was opposing Bolsonaro. It's, of course, it's contradictory. So even in foreign policy, you have lobbies on one side, you have this and that, and you have whatever, I don't know what's happening in the Congress. So the Centrão is now doing this. So I think it reflects that in the end, we have very unstable times. And the whole point we're trying to make in our discussion is that how this instability domestically and regionally are connected to this global level. In the end, the geopolitical thing comes always and always, always again, and putting all these dilemmas. And is it a Cold War? Well, yesterday, actually, Stiglitz said, we are in a new Cold War. And I think this is being debated. Is it, or can you frame it? How can you frame it? So I think it's more about this ongoing instabilities and uncertainties than opportunists in the sense, one country wanting to do this or that. I think Brazil, in the particular situation of BRICS and all these other multilateral, I think it's a very difficult situation. I agree completely. If I don't want to make my opinion now, but I mean, of course, I mean, it's very contradictory. I agree completely. And I think it's the problem is that the governments can fall, and here what comes next can be very problematic. So it is difficult times. I mean, just to close down now, really, that's why we named it somehow this permacrisis. That's the concept we are working on. If it's a crisis like an opportunity, or a crisis something that you end up like going on from one to the other, we'll continue discussing that. We invite you all interest on the topic to continue discussing with you. Now we hope we have more well, discussions, and certainly the publications that we are still working. And really, it has been very, very intensive these 2 days. It would have been longer. I think it would have been also nicer to have other people. We know there are a lot of people working on that, but I want to really just thank you all, those here and those online, and definitely that left good recovery. And I hope we continue these debates. I am very glad really that we could do this debate here today at PUC presentially, because we also were catch up by the COVID. Now we started our research and whoop, jumped online. And it's really good that we are able now, despite all the health problems and policies and so on, that we are able to meet again. So we hope that all these preventive things will allow us to continue to do so. So thank you. I'll really just would like to thank also Bettina again, if we think about the beginning of this research and this network. And yeah, please, let's continue the debates. Have now, yeah, good afternoon there, dinner, and for us here, then also lunch. Thank you very much.